Welcome to this short introduction to biodiversity. So, in this module, we will be trying to understand what is biodiversity. We look into why do we need it, and also reflect a bit on what are the threats on this biodiversity currently. Beginning with what is biodiversity? Biodiversity or biological diversity is in fact denotes life on earth, the variety of life on earth at all its forms, from genes to ecosystems and ecological and evolutionary processes that sustains it. The biodiversity of an ecosystem reflects the variety and abundance of plant and animal species within it. But why do we need biodiversity? The usefulness of biodiversity is, or the values of biodiversity is something that people may have different perceptions, subjective perceptions, according to the lens with which they look into it. The perspective of biodiversity for an oil company, for a land developer, for a government agency, for an environmental group, or the local communities may differ and sometimes contrast. But when we look into the direct use of, or the direct values of biodiversity, there is something essential for us to, have the essential resources like food, medicine, building materials, fiber, fuel, etc. Or its use could be indirect also. How biodiversity is significant in terms of atmospheric and climate regulation, how it is essential for to ensure pollination, nutrient recycling, or sometimes it will be having the cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic values. Now let us try and understand the levels of biodiversity, especially the genetic diversity and species diversity. Genetic diversity includes the variety of genes within an individual or a population. And this is something essential to natural selection and evolutionary changes. I hope you must have heard of Irish potato famine in the history. Why did that happen? So European potato crops in the 19th century, were genetically very similar, as most of it originated from only a very few sources. And when this new disease emerged in 1845, much of the crop was destroyed, and the lack of genetic variation made it difficult to have a kind of a genetic resistance to the disease. And that's how we have approximately 1 million people died from this sudden decline in food availability and revenue. That is about the significance of genetic diversity. Now coming to species diversity. So in that you need to remember two terms, two ideas: the species richness and species evenness. Species richness means the number of different species in a defined area, and species evenness denotes the relative abundance of each species in an area. So, you may wonder what happens when a species is removed from the system? Or how does adding a population, either the translocated herds or the introduction of invasive species, affect an ecosystem? Or why do we need species diversity? Species diversity is something that increases an ecosystem's stability and resilience to disturbances, such as natural disasters, diseases, or any other matter, any kind of disruptions. So let me pose this question. At several sites in Amazon, researchers have documented around 1,200 to 1,500 butterfly species in patches several square kilometers in extent, whereas there are only about 440 species in all of eastern North America. What is the reason? All of you must have used the interactive biomes to identify the biodiversity in different locations. And now let's see what is this reason between the species diversity in Amazon versus Eastern North America. Because the warm tropical ecosystems are richer in species than the cold temperate ecosystems found in high latitudes. And the species diversity is an essential aspect that increases the stability and resilience to any type of disturbances. When we talk about a resilient ecosystem, it is characterized by lack of fluctuation or constancy, inertia, and renewal. And in the asynchronous session, you must have seen a video on Keystone species. Not all species are critical to an ecosystem function, but there will be certain species which would be having an extremely high impact on a particular ecosystem relative to its population. Or they may perform ecological roles that are greater than other would expect based on their abundance. So that is where the understanding of keystone species is also very much important to understand how an ecosystem functions and maintains its stability. So in our discussion on understanding biodiversity, we need to also understand the two related concepts, habitat and niche. If you use some analogy, habitat is like an address, and niche is something like a profession. Habitat is a physical place where an organism lives, or it denotes the environmental, dimensions of an organism. The environment that provides the most essentials like food, water, warmth, minerals, oxygen, and then we have ecological niche. Niche include the total way of life or the functional role of a species in an ecosystem. It includes everything that it does to survive and reproduce. So when we look into an organism, every organism will be having a habitat or the physical part of an ecosystem where it reside and where it depend on the varying abiotic factors. So the habitat could be a small or it could be large. And niche is something that actually helps us to understand how the organism make a living in that particular habitat. And why do we need to understand these two terms in the context of biodiversity. Because according to the competitive exclusion principle, no two species can occupy the same niche in the same environment for a longer time. A typical habitat in the environment is that in which many organisms are living and working together, fulfilling their own ecological niches. And it is advantageous for a species to occupy unique niche in an ecosystem because it reduces the amount of competition for resources that the species may encounter. Let me talk about the study by Robert MacArthur. So he was studying on the five North American warbler species, and this diagram talks about the three types of warbler species whose habitat is same, but how there is a kind of a resource partitioning, or how their niches are ecological niches are different. So although it appears that the niches of these three birds are identical, but actually they spend their time eating different parts of the spruces or other conifer trees, so that there is less competition and they cohabit the same region. They occupy the same habitat. And in this context, we also need to remember the ability of certain species to thrive in a range of habitats, or some species which are having a generic niche, like the pigeon or the cockroaches. But on the other side, we have very specialists, some species having very limited diet, very stricter habitat requirements, like the polar bear, the panda, the koala, or the hornbills, reflect a bit on the differences between generic niche and specific niche to have a better perspective on why certain species are considered to be endangered. And we also have, and when we think about, a species having a generic niche, it will be having more possibility of survival to the external changes because, of their generic niche. On the other hand, those specialists would be under more risk. Similar would be the case of endemic species. There will be certain species, certain organisms that will not travel large distances or disperse their seeds or gametes widely, and their genetic diversity would be mostly restricted to local populations. Think about examples for this. And from a biodiversity point of view, from a conservation point of view, how can we understand them? Now we come to the third aspect. What are the threats to biodiversity? Starting from ecological fragmentation to the introduction of invasive species to unsustainable use of resources, pollution, and the wider climate change, all these can have a direct impact on biodiversity. The factors having an indirect impacts include overpopulation, overconsumption, the approach towards conservation, and the lack of effective enforcement of conservation policies. And we live at a time when we have to be increasingly conscious about the rate at which we witness, you know, biodiversity erosion. And United Nations have proclaimed 22nd of May as the International Day for Biological Diversity as a move to increase our awareness and understanding of biodiversity issues. And the theme for the current year is Our Solutions Are in Nature. Because of the COVID-19 issue, most of these programs would be online. I would urge all of you to reflect a bit on this theme and try to think about human interventions and its impact on biodiversity. This would be helping us to think about how to establish priorities for biodiversity conservation. Or I would say more than this, it is something that connects with the question of our own sustainability in this planet. If you look at the evolution of biodiversity, the biodiversity as we understand and experience today is actually a product of the processes of extinctions and speciation. The history of Earth have witnessed at least five major extinctions, beginning with the first extinction of small marine organisms around 440 million years ago to the tropical marine species extinction around 365 million years ago. And then we had the largest mass extinction event in Earth's history, affecting a range of species, including many vertebrates, which happened around 250 million years ago. And another on about 210 million years ago, where we had the extinction of other vertebrate species on land that allowed dinosaurs to flourish. And the last extinction that wiped out all the non avian dinosaurs that happened around 65.5 million years ago. And today, scientists predict that the species Homo sapiens might be the cause of the sixth major extinction in history. This is where we need to reflect on the imprint of this particular species called Homo sapiens on this planet Earth and how it impacts the biodiversity. So I stopped this lecture by giving some thoughts for you to reflect on our own position and our own role in this planet, and what is the perspective with which we as Homo sapiens looks at the biodiversity around us, and being a species having the most generic niche, how our interventions or our actions result in some grave consequences. And I hope to see you in class with some of these reflections in mind. Thank you.